Good afternoon and good morning, Tom. We are excited to have you here, and I'm going to give people a couple minutes to join us, and then we'll get started. So maybe a minute or two. For those of you that are just joining, we're going to give it another minute and we will get started. Okay, so because we have lots to talk about today, we're going to get started here. My name is Ellen Miller, and I am NIJC's Pro Bono Manager. I'm joined on the screen today by Heidi Altman, our Director of Policy at NIJC, and Ruben Loyo, who is our Senior Litigation Attorney, or one of our Senior Litigation Attorneys, and we are excited to have you. Welcome back to the Policy Corner. This is a monthly presentation that we intend to give updates on current important issues in immigration policy and how it is impacting our clients and their ability to access legal protections to which they're entitled. Currently for this webinar, due to the amount of participants that we're anticipating, everybody is muted. We do encourage you to ask any questions or leave a comment by typing in the chat box. We'll monitor or do our best to monitor those throughout the presentation, but at the end, we will open up for Q&A. We will also be sending all materials in the follow-up email after this presentation. So today we are talking about the budget as a moral document, appropriations, and how to advance a more humane system. We will be talking about Defund Hate, which you might have seen in our initial title, and we'll be explaining what we mean by that and how we're working within that. Okay. For those of you that may not be familiar with NIJC, I'll give you a quick overview. We are a broad-based immigration legal service provider with our headquarters in Chicago. We have offices in 5 cities across the country, including Indiana, or 2 in Indiana, Washington, D.C., and now San Diego, California, covering Southern California. We have served over 10,000 non-citizens every year, and we really can only do this because of our pro bono network that exponentially increases our impact in policy initiatives, direct legal services, and larger litigation efforts. What we consider that's different about NIJC is that we do a high volume of direct services, a high volume of federal litigation, and zealous policy work. These components all come together so that we can take the stories of our clients and our lawyers to influence litigation and policy goals for a more just system. You are all part of this network today, and so we are very excited that you showed up and that you're interested in staying informed on these current issues. So it's without further ado that I have the privilege of introducing my colleagues again, Heidi Altman, Director of Policy, and Ruben Loyo, our Senior Litigation Attorney. So I'm going to turn it over to Heidi. Take it away.
Hey everyone, thank you Ellen for the introduction, and Ellen and Ruben, it's great to be here with both of you. We're so grateful that there's been so much interest in this series. It's really exciting for us, and we appreciate you taking time out of your day during this time of uncertainty and challenges for everyone to learn a little bit more about the issues facing immigrant communities and NIJC's work. So I, as Ellen said, I direct our policy work at NIJC, and we're here to talk about appropriations. And because that's a word that tends to sort of immediately cause people's eyes to glass over, we're gonna try to bring it to life. I'm gonna do a little road mapping right now and lay out what to expect during this presentation. Before I do that, I'm going to do two quick things. One is I really want to encourage everyone to be thinking throughout the presentation about your questions and your comments. This is going to be the first time during our Policy Corner presentations when we have the capacity to have now live questions and answers. And so really excited to dig into this with you and hopefully spend a good amount of time on that. Second, I'm going to ask everyone to you know, if you're multitasking, stop for a second and think about a time recently outside of your professional capacity in your personal life when you decided to make a purchase, maybe a little bit of a bigger purchase. And presumably when you decided to make that purchase, you decided that you were gonna maybe forego another purchase. So I want you to think about what that thing was that you decided to buy, and then ask yourself if that decision represents any values or morals or principles that you hold as an individual, or that you and the people you live with, whether that's roommates or family members, hold as individuals. Just think about that for a moment, and if you want to, go ahead and type it into the chat, what the purchase was and what the value represents. No pressure, but we thought it might be fun. So I'm just going to give everyone like 30 seconds of silence to think through this and put your example in the chat if you would like to do so. Okay, so feel free to put these in the chat as we're talking at any time throughout the presentation as they occur to you. Because the reason why we're asking you to think about this is because just the way that, just as your purchases in your personal life reflect the values and principles and priorities that you and your family and your loved ones make in your lives, so do we believe here at NIJC that the way that our government spends taxpayer dollars and appropriated funds also reflects our national values and priorities. And that's why we focus some of our policy, a good amount of our policy and advocacy resources on appropriations and on the budget. And it's why we've invited you to come in and talk about this topic with us today, which we believe is really important. And I'm seeing the chat start to come in, which is really fun. Yes, right, purchasing a car for your daughter represents these values, right, of safety and reliability to get to work. So, you know, please feel free to read through the chats as they're coming in, and we can circle back to them as we go through. We're going to go through our agenda for today, starting a little bit with sort of what is the appropriations process, why are we talking about it? Always, as Ellen said, at NIJC, rooting that conversation and the impact that this work and this issue has on our clients and our clients' loved ones and communities. Third, we're going to talk a little bit about what we're doing about it. What does it mean when we talk about NIJC focusing our policy resources on appropriations? And then after that, we're going to talk, as we always do, a little bit about how you can get involved. So why are we here today? Why are we talking about appropriations? Moving on to the next slide. So for a long time now at NIJC, we've realized that we really believe you cannot have a holistic understanding or perspective on immigration law and policy in the United States without engaging deeply in the federal government and appropriations law. And you may have heard this truism often repeated that the Department of Homeland Security has by far the largest budget of any federal law enforcement agency. So that includes when you think about agencies like the FBI and the DEA, right? Particularly because so much about immigration enforcement really focuses on the foundational discretion that the agency exercises within the executive branch, the amount of funding available to the agencies, and the restrictions or lack thereof on the use of those funds, we believe often has at least an equal, if not sometimes greater correlation to on-the-ground practice of immigration law and policy than even the Immigration and Nationality Act. And so for this reason, we want to be there. We want to be engaged at every step of the appropriations process throughout its annual cycle. And we're going to talk a little bit more in a bit about what that engagement looks like. The slide that you have in front of you just is a little sort of 101 on appropriations, right? What is appropriations? How does it interplay with the federal government? So you have a little arrowed circle at the top there, which is timeline. So every February, by law, the president and the White House have to release their budget, which is sort of like their wish list for how they would like the executive branch and its agencies to be funded. After that budget is released, Congress goes through the process of engaging in oversight of the budget requests that the White House has put out for every agency, and eventually writes and then considers through committee a package of 12 different bills. So these 12 bills, when they come together, fund using taxpayer dollars the entirety of the federal government. And the kind of big date that looms over all this is September 30th. September 30th is the end of the government's fiscal year. If there is no set of appropriations bills, all 12 of them passed by September 30th, then one of two things can happen. One is that Congress will adopt a continuing resolution for some or all agencies, which basically means that the government just keeps on chugging using the budget that was passed into law for the previous fiscal year. You'll hear that referred to as a CR. If there's no appropriations bills actually signed into law and no continuing resolution, that's when the government shuts down. And because of this particular White House's insistence, especially on large sums of money for the border wall, which has proven so controversial, immigration issues have been pretty front and center in these sort of shutdown showdowns that have happened a couple of years in a row now, and you can see the headlines on the slide here. The chart also in the slide in front of you just kind of gives you a little bit of a picture of what these budget proposals look like and the really enormous sums of money that we're talking about. So moving on to the next slide, with our appropriations and budget work at NIJC, we focus our work on funding for three agencies: the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Justice, which oversees, of course, the immigration courts right now, and then the Department of Health and Human Services, which is where the budget for refugee resettlement and unaccompanied kids services for unaccompanied immigrant children, where those live. But the slide that you have in front of you focuses in a little bit on the Department of Homeland Security's budgets, right? This slide explains a little bit about why we focus much of our time on the DHS budget, and you can see the enormous influxes of funds into these agencies. These charts in front of you show the increase in appropriated budgets, well, in total budgets actually, for these agencies. And the reason why we start in 2004 is because that's the first year that Congress appropriated funds for the Department of Homeland Security, right, which was newly created after September 11th. And of course, you see much debate, especially this summer, ongoing about whether that was a mistake by Congress in sort of putting so many agencies together into this enormous one federal agency. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, now for fiscal year 2020 has this $8.4 billion budget, which is more than twice where its budget started in 2004. And CBP's budget has nearly tripled in those same years, up to $17.4 billion. Just as like a point of comparison, I'll throw out a couple other numbers in the federal budget. The FBI's annual budget is just under $10 billion, and the DEA's budget is at about $2.3 billion. So moving on to the next slide, we have these huge sums of money going into these agencies. And what I want to touch on for a minute is that in addition to the sort of massive surging of funds, over the past few years, especially at NIJC, we have focused in on monitoring, analyzing, and reporting on what we see as a very alarming growth in corruption within the agency's use of their appropriated funds, and an erosion of checks and balances with regard to how the executive branch approaches the use of appropriated funds for immigration enforcement. And the reason why checks and balances are implicated here, of course, is because the Constitution itself gives the power of the purse to Congress. Congress and Congress alone was intended by the founders to have authority over how much money is available to these federal agencies and restrictions on its use. But instead, we've seen this sort of creep towards overreach. And in this slide, you'll see we put forward sort of 4 examples of the ways in which we've seen this creeping overreach and corruption. One that I'll spend the most time on is what we refer to here as massive transfers of funds. So most spending bills, most appropriations bills give the agencies some wiggle room to move money around, right, from one account to another. And so, for example, I'm just looking at the chat box here, right, and John just wrote that he helped his daughter, purchase a car. That might have been money that he originally intended to use for rent or for a mortgage. And we all have to have flexibility in our budget because things change to move things around from one intended purpose to another. What's happened here, though, is that essentially we have seen over the course of years that the Department of Homeland Security especially has learned how to manipulate the ability to move funds or transfer funds between accounts in a way that undermines congressional intent. We first started noticing in the first year of the Trump administration that ICE was very dramatically growing its detention system, that the number of prisons and jails being used to incarcerate immigrants during their civil immigration court cases was just escalating. And when we looked back at the spending bills, we saw that Congress had explicitly stated in the bills, in addition to the funding provided in the actual report that explains why those numbers were provided, that Congress was not intending for ICE to have the capacity to grow the system in that way. So we started asking why, and that led to this multi-year process through combination of FOIA and partnership with congressional offices to request documents, to us having now documented for 4 years in a row, along with colleagues at other organizations, that DHS has really manipulated this transfer authority to move massive hundreds of millions of dollars, mass sums, into an expansion of its detention and enforcement apparatus. And where has that money come from? It has been taken away from other domestic priorities, often including FEMA, usually right before hurricane season, because this often happens over the summer, The money has come from the Coast Guard and from TSA, Aviation Security, and other accounts. There's three other ways in the slide here that we have monitored and documented this sort of growth in what we see as corruption and overreach. I'll just flag that many of you probably have seen the billions of dollars that have been moved out of Treasury and the Department of Defense into border wall construction through the President's the President's emergency declaration. We've also seen, and the Government Accountability Office has confirmed, an unlawful use of funds by Customs and Border Protection for things like dirt bikes and all-terrain vehicles, enforcement-related purchases with appropriated funds that Congress explicitly stated were to be used for humanitarian reasons like medical care and food supplies. So we are tracking all of these things. We are concerned about them. And why are we so concerned about them? Well, let's think about who's impacted. So moving on to the next slide. All of our clients, all of their loved ones, immigrant communities nationally, and then all of our communities are impacted. The surging of funds into ICE and CBP has coincided with a time when we've seen unleashing of unprecedented laws and policies that continue to prioritize enforcement over nearly any other component of immigration policy, while at the same time undermining the United States' legal, domestic, and international obligations to protect asylum seekers and other immigrant communities. And the availability of almost unlimited funds for this domestic agenda has had a dramatic and harmful impact on immigrant communities and all of us. Perhaps one place where we at NIJC and our clients see this very dramatically has been the availability of these massive multi-million and even billion-dollar detention contracts. So the funds for these contracts flow from us, the taxpayers, through Congress to private prison companies and local jails that now contract with ICE to incarcerate immigrants solely because they're facing civil immigration proceedings. And as some of you have heard from us in some of our previous presentations, during the pandemic, immigration detention, which was already the site of systemic abuses and harms, has become even more life-threatening for our clients and others. So before we talk about what NIJC is doing specifically on appropriations, we're going to stay for a moment on this question of who is impacted. You're going to hear from Ruben, who sees these enormous sums of money impacting his clients and his work every day. But before that, we're going to play a clip for you. You're going to hear a clip of an NIJC client named Johannes, who was jailed for nearly a year during the, much of it during the pandemic in an immigration jail while awaiting his green card. Thankfully, Johannes is now free with an NIJC legal team, having gone to many different legal venues to make that happen. And I was really privileged to have the opportunity to provide testimony along with Johannes to a panel of lawmakers in the Democratic majority and the House Judiciary Committee who held a roundtable focused on detention, immigration detention in the early days of the pandemic. And so you are going to hear a little bit about Johannes's experience, which happened because of the availability of almost unlimited funds for ICE to continue jail immigrants even during a pandemic. And I think Ellen is going to tee that video up for us now.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Johannes Favi, and I'm speaking to you today from Indianapolis, where I live with my wife and our children. I'm grateful to have the chance to be with them because only weeks ago, I was in immigration detention in a county jail in Kankakee, Illinois. I was detained there for almost 1 year waiting for the government to process a petition filed for my green card. While I was detained, my wife gave birth to our second child and our family lost our home. I met our new baby in a picture by mail. I saw a man detained with me hang himself to try to commit suicide. I feel traumatized still today from all that I saw. I'm 32-year-old and I have lived in the United States since 2013. My wife and I have 2 children, 1.5-year-old little girl and a 5-month-old son. We are also raising my 5-year-old daughter who has a serious health issue that requires regular hospital visits. I have a history of health problems too, including a severe case of pneumonia that left me with ongoing respiratory problems. In June 2019, immigration officer arrested me at a courthouse in Indiana when I appeared in connection with an old case from 2015. That case is the only time I have ever been arrested, and I paid a heavy price when I accepted the plea bargain and spent months in jail. However, because of that old conviction, I was in immigration detention for nearly a year with no bond hearing. It felt to me like I was assumed guilty without having a chance to prove my innocence. Most of the people detained with me had no chance. And I would see that every Friday when they would deport 15 or more people at a time out of our cell block. Many people are deported so fast that between transfer, they are unable to communicate with their family abroad or even see a judge before they leave. The rest of us who tried to fight our case felt that we were desperately waiting for our turn to be slaughtered. Some waited for a year or 2 or 3 years surviving on antidepressant pills. I believe more than 60% of my block was on pills during the holiday season. A week before my son was born, I broke down. I was so stressed, anxious, that I was unable to sleep for 3 days. Being in that jail for so long, it felt like torture. ICE has the power to free you, but they don't want to. Keeping you in jail gets to your mind, to your soul. So you want to give up on your freedom and even on your life.
Okay, we're gonna go back to our presentation and Ruben will continue.
Yes, thanks, Ellen. And again, everyone, I'm Ruben Loyo. I'm a member of NIJC's federal litigation team, and I want to speak for just a few minutes about the impact that the funding choices at the federal level have had on the communities that we serve and some of the work that we've been doing through both our direct services projects, but also our federal litigation to combat some of these effects. So as Heidi was mentioning earlier, what we've seen in recent years is just a rapid expansion of the immigration detention system, and it's become, in many ways, a defining feature of our immigration enforcement system. And in this system, cases like Mr. Favi's, unfortunately, are not unique. We are now seeing and have been seeing historic levels of detention in the prior fiscal year, exceeding 50,000 individuals at one point, and in immigration detention on a daily basis. And in recent years, the expansion of immigration detention, as Heidi was saying, has resulted in lucrative contracts being afforded to private prison companies. Dozens of new immigration detention centers have been open, often in remote locations in the country, in Texas, in Louisiana, and elsewhere in the South, where, as you might imagine, our clients are often isolated from their family members, but also very far from legal services providers who might help them with their cases. And even in light of the pandemic, ICE was very resistant to drastically reducing its population in immigration custody, which experts agreed was necessary in order to avoid what ultimately happened, which was massive outbreaks of COVID-19 in immigration facilities. And at NIJC, we ended up filing close to 30 federal habeas corpus petitions in recent months in order to obtain the liberty of clients who have been detained in facilities across the nation, often in deplorable conditions. And thanks to the efforts of colleagues in other organizations nationwide, we finally have seen some reduction in the immigration detainee population. But again, it's only as a result of concerted advocacy efforts nationwide. In addition to the expansion of immigration detention, the funding choices at the federal level has also permitted the increased militarization of enforcement in the interior. We often hear news reports and threats of the administration threatening to deploy specialized SWAT-like teams to welcoming cities to round up our community members. But in many parts of the country, these threats are already a reality. And what we've seen in recent years is just a greater militarization of immigration enforcement. And so by that, I mean just a greater use of abusive tactics in our communities. So we've seen, for instance, massive home raids, massive workplace raids. In fact, one of the largest workplace raid in history occurred last year in Mississippi in a chicken processing plant. We've also seen, as in Mr. Favi's case, arrests in courthouses where individuals are appearing in connection with other matters. And one thing we've also seen often in the Chicago area and in the Midwest is ICE also engaging in indiscriminate traffic stops, often based on nothing but the racial appearance of the occupants of the vehicle. And in fact, we recently filed a lawsuit challenging ICE's practice of engaging in suspicionless and warrantless stops, including of vehicles here in Chicago, along with our partners at the ACLU of Illinois and Winston and Strawn. Supporting this type of militarized enforcement, ICE has also been increasingly investing in the greater use of technology and surveillance techniques. So by that, I mean greater use of biometric devices in the context of enforcement, and also greater efforts to engage in surveillance of social media, GPS monitoring, and all of this has just led to a very militarized immigration enforcement regime in the interior. Similarly, this has occurred along the border as well, obviously with the construction of the border wall, the deployment of troops to the border, and the result of the deployment of troops and the growth of CBP along the border, again, has been massive human rights violations, particularly of asylum seekers. We've, at NIJC, we've been litigating several cases that relate to the government's asylum bans. We also have an office in San Diego where we serve individuals who are arrested at the border by CBP and then referred to the Department of Justice for prosecution for illegal entry, and even in instances where individuals are coming to seek asylum. So we've been monitoring CBP's abuses at the border and detentions of asylum seekers in a systemic way. So with that, I'll just turn it over to Heidi to discuss some of the work that we're doing on a policy level.
Thank you so much, Ruben. So you've heard a lot about the impact and you've heard a little bit about the process that we're actually talking about here. So what is NIJC is doing? What is our approach and what is the work that we're doing toward that approach? I'm going to talk about two coalitions that NIJC works in, which serve as the hub for our appropriations work. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of our philosophical approach to appropriations work. So the slide that you see right now is about the Defund Hate Coalition. This is a coalition that NIJC has been proud to be a part of for several years. It's a coalition consisting of dozens of organizations across the country. And part of what makes this coalition unique is that we marry grassroots and field level organizing led by impacted community members with legislative advocacy and education and policy work here in DC. We bring those together to advocate for our big picture goal, which is cuts, decreased funding for Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, and Customs and Border Protection, CBP, detention and enforcement. So people often ask me sort of, what does Defund Hate mean? Why is that the name of the coalition, and what does it represent? So I'm going to talk a little bit about that for a minute. The existing immigration enforcement system in the United States is dramatically different in scope and in sort of approach than any other civil enforcement system that you would look at. The amount of funds and effort and resources spent on enforcement are dramatically out of proportion from the underlying violation of law, which is a civil status infraction. And in the inverse, NGOs and community-based organizations providing legal services and case management services and social and medical and mental health services to arriving immigrants are dramatically underfunded and struggling to find resources. Additionally, we see, and of course, if you read NIJC's public-facing materials, you'll see every day that the type and style of US government enforcement of federal immigration laws is mired in systemic human rights abuses, corruption, and a culture of dehumanization of migrants and immigrants. As we've spoken about, and you know, if you're a regular participant in NIJC events, you understand well that we've now seen a steady trickle and flow of evidence and internal government memos that clearly reveal that in recent years, many of the immigration policies flowing from this administration have been developed with the explicit intent to pursue a white supremacist agenda. And so the Defund Hate Coalition believes, and we take our name from the principle, that this dramatic surge in funds toward harsh detention and enforcement policies in the immigration arena, policies rooted in philosophies of hate, make all of our communities less safe. These policies instill fear in communities, and they chip away at trust in local, federal, and government institutions. Just this morning, as we were preparing for this presentation, I noticed that NBC News put out the results of a new report that looks at the dramatic and alarming high levels of fear among Latinx high school students in the United States, regardless of their own citizenship or immigration status, finding that more than half of the students surveyed reported living in desperate fear that they or someone close to them would be arrested and deported, and that this sort of constantly prevalent fear and anxiety, as you can imagine, leads to very high rates of post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, depression, and other serious health concerns. So the goal of the Defund Hate Coalition, therefore, is to look for a different way of approaching this, cuts in funding for enforcement and detention, and investments instead in communities and investments in projects and approaches that make all of us safe and secure. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that divest invest frame at the very end of the presentation. So we bring this messaging to all of our substantive advocacy. We always have appropriations in mind, especially when we're doing education work with members of Congress and their staff. And one example of that is at the very same roundtable where Johannes presented his testimony that you saw a few minutes ago. When I spoke about detention representing NIJC, we connected it to appropriations and connected the members of Congress' own ability to dramatically rein in these harms by reducing enforcement. And Congressman Nadler, who is the chair of the House Judiciary Committee, expressed some interest in that approach. And so we're going to play a quick clip of my exchange with Congressman Nadler on this issue right now.
Well, thank you very much. I have one further question, and that is, we've heard from our other witnesses appalling statements of the conditions in the ICE detention facilities, 4 or 8 people to a cell, inability to have social distancing, inability to get enough soap, all the conditions calculated to generate an epidemic, to generate cases of COVID-19 among the detainees and staff, and to make these detention facilities hotbeds to spread the disease throughout the community. Now, Chairwoman Lofgren and I have written letter after letter to the department saying, stop this, release people from detention, etc. And I refer to my opening statement to the fact that historically this has all been civil, not criminal. That it shouldn't be most people in detention, and we've been ignored essentially, as you know. I am intrigued by a mention you made of appropriations. Do you think that it would be effective if we were to say in the next appropriations bill, which probably which doesn't go into effect unfortunately until September, but that you can't spend any appropriations to keep people in detention or something to that effect? You must release them?
Yes, very simple. I think that, for too long now, ICE has disregarded the balance of powers. Appropriations committees have been saying for years that it's time to move away from reliance on incarceration, and ICE has gone in the opposite direction, blatantly disregarding the funding amounts that Congress has provided. And so, yes, I cannot say more emphatically to that idea, Congressman Nadler. We have the studies, we have the evidence. We know that the investment of funds will go so much further, both in terms of supporting people, supporting communities, and making the immigration court system work efficiently by instituting community-based alternative programs where people have case management and they're set up for success, rather than being held in a punitive system when these are civil proceedings. So we know how to do it. We know how to use the funds if they're given to the community and invested, instead of taking away and putting the money towards these jails that are causing so much harm.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ellen. So as you can see there, I saw in the chat box actually that Sarah, thank you, Sarah, asked a question about whether Congress can do anything about it. And so you see in this exchange here that we are constantly keeping in mind these top line advocacy asks that we have as part of the Defund Hate Coalition. At the top level, cuts to ICE and CBP's enforcement and detention budgets. And that means that we are opposed to the creation of the border wall, that we are asking for dramatic cuts to detention, and no new funds for agents, enforcement agents. But we're also asking for accountability measures on spending. And that means reducing or eliminating entirely, for example, DHS's ability to move funds around in the way I discussed earlier. Moving into the next slide, a lot of that work on accountability we do as part of another coalition that we at NIJC jointly lead with our colleagues at an organization called the American Immigration Council. This is a project where every year we go really, really deep in the weeds, and we put together, along with dozens of other organizations, usually dozens of pages of language proposals that can go in the spending bills or their accompanying reports for DHS, for Department of Justice, for Health and Human Services, that we believe will help the agencies be kept cabined to the existing law, to civil rights and human rights restrictions in the way that funds are used. One example that I think is sort of hiding behind in the slide here is that through this process, we've been able to make incremental but really significant change every year towards protections written into the appropriations law and report for transgender people who are, of course, at extremely heightened risk of harm and abuse in immigration detention. The next slide, and where I'm going to close, is to mention sort of the way we approach this work, which is through what we call with our Defund Hate Coalition partners a Divest Invest framework, which you heard me lay out a little bit in my back and forth with Congressman Nadler there. But we believe that the way we approach appropriations is all about where we think money needs to be taken away, but also where we think money needs to be placed. And so I saw in the chat that Beth talked about the fact that she recently invested in mutual aid funds And when she did that, she also decided that she was not going to be spending some money on some other, so maybe what might have been luxury items for her. So she divested from some things she might have bought for herself and invested in mutual aid funds to help her communities. And that's what we're looking for here, is that we think cuts for enforcement and detention after literally decades of surging funds towards enforcement and detention that has so dramatically harmed immigrant communities. It's time to divest and pull money away from those priorities. And it's time to invest and surge funds into our communities, into organizations that stand at the ready to provide case management, to provide legal services, to provide support and integration for newly arrived immigrants and also immigrants facing immigration court proceedings. And so the next and the last slide before we turn to what you can do in questions is a quick excerpt from a report we did last year called A Better Way, where as part of that report, we talked about calling for an end to detention and investment in case management programming in the alternative. And our client, an NIJC client, Izzy, who I spoke with, I asked him, what would it have meant for you if when you arrived in the United States, instead of going into a detention system, you went directly into a case management focused system that was looking at your needs as a whole person, including mental health services and medical services and legal support? And he didn't even miss a beat. He just immediately said to me, if there was another way, it would change everything. And he talked about how instead of having to recover from the time he spent in detention, he could have been getting a job, working to rebuild his life here, and he wouldn't have to walk down the street feeling triggered every time he hears a police siren. So we're gonna now, of course, focus always on what you can do. In this case, we really have this evergreen ask. Anytime you feel like it, you can pick up the phone, call your members of Congress and the Senate and the House, and emphasize that you too believe that it's time to cut funding for ICE and CBP enforcement and instead invest in our communities. We have the other asks and ways that you can always engage with NIJC here, including, of course, if you are an attorney who takes pro bono cases, taking on a case. And with that, we're going to open it up to questions and answers. I don't know, Ellen, if you have guidance you want to give on the tech component of this.
For sure, thank you. These presentations are always so inspiring and just always a good reminder too of what we can do. So right before Q&A, I just wanted to also highlight a few other things, is that as Heidi mentioned in the beginning, we think about how to choose or spend our personal funds, and now we're choosing how Congress can spend our funds. So this link here will provide a template if you decide to click there, and that's a way you can get involved. We are also sharing client stories and providing regular updates on legal services, federal litigation, and policy efforts. So please visit our website. If you're a lawyer, I'm just going to highlight what Heidi just mentioned, is that right now we have 70 cases on the list. If you are a lawyer, your representation can save a life, as immigrants do not have a right to counsel. We have a number of trainings and presentations coming up in October to support the Pro Bono Network, so check out our website and make sure that you register and share it with your colleagues. Last but not least, please vote. Your voice does matter. And right before the Q&A here, I am going to say also that there is a brief survey. It's about 5 questions. And you can hold up your device to this QR code right there that's on the screen, and it'll take you there. And you can give us your feedback of what you thought, what else you'd like to hear, some other questions you might have. We do read through these and we do consider them for future presentations, so your feedback is important. Now, for the Q&A, we have a number of questions that have already come through. If you have other questions, curiosities, comments, please type them into the chat box. If you're unable to type, you can raise your hand and use the hand raise option, and we will unmute you to ask your question orally. There are quite a few people on the line right now, and so we won't unmute everybody. So let's get started with the questions. let's see here. Heidi, I know that you were diligently, combing through some of them. And one of the questions that came through earlier was how the Appropriations Committee can impede the reallocation of funds to DHS. Do you want to just briefly highlight that? I think we covered it with the committee, but.
Yeah, I can dig into that. I'm going to combine that actually with a question that has just come in from Jim, which is about how coalitions are working together to coordinate thinking on this question of sort of loopholes or ways that the agency has sort of gotten around congressional intent to put resources towards detention and enforcement when Congress doesn't intend it. Yeah, so I mean, basically every year these bills have to be passed. And so I think for me, the simplest way to think about it is that if Congress decides that the agencies need to be prioritizing enforcement less, let's say, and legal services more, then Congress certainly has been given by the Constitution and the founders the ability to decrease funds here and increase funds here, right? So they could, for example, provide a significantly higher amount of money for the legal orientation program, which is in the detention centers, Know Your Rights programming. One provision that is exciting in this year's House Appropriations bill, which has not yet become law, but has passed out of the House, is the appropriations bill that funds the Department of Justice, has a pilot program in it for direct representation for asylum seekers arriving at the border. So Congress can choose to invest in these programs, and they can also choose to decrease funding levels for the account, which is called the custody operations account that funds detention, or the accounts that fund investigations and enforcement actions in ICE. In terms of the loopholes, we have analyzed and have a really clear picture of what changes would need to be made in the appropriations bill to limit the agency's ability to move funds around and grab monies from other agencies or other accounts to kind of do an end run around congressional intent when it comes to detention and enforcement. And these asks are part of our top line asks with the Defund Hate Coalition, and also in this other work that we do where we submit specific proposals to all of the relevant offices every year as the appropriations cycle heats up. We always have those specific proposals really clearly submitted, and as part of our priorities. It's our belief at this time on Defund Hate with our coalition partners and also at NIJC that the agency has sort of proven itself unable to responsibly minister its transfer authorities given to it under law. And so our position is that those authorities should be taken entirely away. And if the agency needs more funds for any legitimate reasons, it can always do so. It can obtain additional funds by asking for supplemental funding through Congress.
Thanks. I think another interesting question here, and Ruben, you can maybe weigh in on this, and Heidi tag team, of course. But could detention centers, well, considering Illinois is a sanctuary state, could detention centers in Illinois be challenged based on the fact that Illinois is a sanctuary state?
Well, one of the ways in which sort of Illinois has led on this issue is just banning the use of private detention facilities. And other states are following suit in this regard. And of course, the Trust Act limits, the Illinois Trust Act limits some cooperation between local authorities and immigration and customs enforcement. It doesn't expressly reach the use of local facilities through contracts with ICE, but it does limit some cooperation. To add anything, Heidi?
Okay. Thanks, Ruben. Yeah, so NIJC has been really active about getting involved in some of those contracts and the Trust Act. So that's great. There's a question here, Heidi, about USCIS and what's happening with CIS, and we hear about the budgets and the furloughs and everything else. Can you speak more on that?
Yeah, thank you so much, Cynthia, for asking this question about USCIS. So USCIS is the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. This is the sub-agency within DHS that is tasked with adjudicating benefits, asylum, employment authorization benefits, and naturalization and other benefits. And it's long been sort of seen kind of described as like the customer service wing of DHS. It's an agency that has been sort of badly trampled and mismanaged under this administration. And as a result of this mismanagement is now facing a funding crisis. It is debated the extent to which that crisis has been sort of manufactured or is legitimate. But regardless, the agency a couple months ago announced and made clear that it was planning to furlough 2/3 of its workers. That furlough was delayed while the agency tried to sort of work with Congress to get some emergency supplemental funding for the agency. When it didn't come through, the furloughs were still set to take effect at the end of August. As of last week, those furloughs were canceled indefinitely, which is a relief obviously for the many, many workers who would have lost their jobs and their livelihood for a time at least, but also for our legal service teams and our clients, right, who would be facing tremendous backlogs if that much of the workforce was furloughed. It remains to be seen what's going to happen with the end of the fiscal year. And so if you follow these issues, as you see the end of the fiscal year approach, the question of whether and how the federal government will be providing bailout funds to USCIS is certainly going to be a part of the negotiations over both a continuing resolution, which is the most likely next step in the government funding cycle for this year, and or any COVID stimulus package. And so we will be working and monitoring that, and also making sure that the offices involved are educated and keeping top of their minds restrictions such that any funds provided to USCIS cannot be used and transferred, as we've been talking about, inappropriately for ICE and CBP enforcement purposes.
Thanks, Heidi. I think also it's obvious that we're in an election year right now. You know, how does the election year impact this process, or does it, I guess? And are there other ways that, say, you know, the next administration or the continuing administration, is there a way that there's other accountability mechanisms that we could look for, you know, with this election process?
Yeah, so I mean, I can answer that one quickly, so we maybe have time to get to one or two more before the end. Basically, I think the elections usually mean that it's unlikely that the appropriations bills will actually pass out of Congress and become law right in the middle of an election cycle. And so we're anticipating that this year funding will be continued for DHS and other agencies through a continuing resolution, and that the sort of fight/negotiation over new funding levels and restrictions will be punted until the end of the year or early next year.
There's one question here that I'm excited about from Romelia. And it's looking at how important, or Romelia asked, how important is it for immigrant rights organizations like NIJC to also advocate for issues of mass incarceration and police violence against African American communities, or maybe kind of the intersection of these issues? Ruben or Heidi?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very important, and I think we've all realized that these issues are interconnected, and the same ask that we make as immigrant rights advocate is sort of the same ask that's made in other movements, and that's to do away with this over-reliance on incarceration, particularly of Black, brown communities. And so I think it's very important for organizations like NIJC, and we are stepping up in this regard to advocate for the elimination of mass incarceration and violence of the police.
Yeah, I can just chime in quickly if I can, that I am so grateful to you, Ro, for asking the question, and it's beyond critical. And we are working and interested in input and thinking from all of our supporters on how our policy work can be actively anti-racist in as effective a way as possible. We're going to be putting out a short sort of policy brief next week that we hope you'll all take a look at, that focuses on the immigration detention system and provides some new analysis of data that we have crunched, providing essentially broken down into different reasons why we believe it's time for the immigration detention system to end. And we took a deeper look there at the ways in which immigration detention, as one example of the enforcement system, really disproportionately harms Black and Brown communities, and where the systemic racism that we see in the criminal legal system is sort of picked up and imported into the immigration detention and enforcement systems. And so I hope you'll all take a look at that and give us any feedback.
So respecting everybody's time, I think we're going to end it here. We really appreciate Heidi and Ruben. Thank you for your time today and for all NIJC teams that are putting this together, for everybody showing up and asking your questions. Please continue the dialogue, and we will be sending this information out. And so continue to visit our website, and we look forward to seeing you next month for the Policy Corner. Thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you all for joining.